Within our lifetime, we will free Palestine.
Welcome to Current Affairs. Today, instead of the usual full-length interview, we're going to talk about one of the most important things happening in our country. At college campuses all across the United States, protesters are coming out in support of the Palestinian people. Many have launched so-called Gaza solidarity encampments, peacefully demonstrating against U.S. support for Israel's war on Palestine and demanding their universities divest from corporations with ties to Israel. In a number of cases, university administrations have responded by calling out the police to forcibly disperse and arrest students, suspending many. In response to the repression, protests have grown further, with many university faculty condemning the abridgment of the right to dissent. We'll talk more about these remarkable uprisings and the reaction to them, but first, it's important to discuss what's actually happening in Palestine that is fueling these protests. The Wall Street Journal ran an op-ed recently arguing that the protesters are being groomed by Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis. Similarly, Jonathan Greenblatt of the Anti-Defamation League argued that organizations like Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine were essentially Iranian proxies.
Iran has their military proxies, like Hezbollah, and Iran has their campus proxies, like these groups like SJP and JVP. Look at them. This is literally like a demonstration in Tehran, and you can't believe it's happening in Morningside Heights.
But the truth is that you only need to listen to the student protesters and read their statements to understand that they are sincerely motivated by their horror at human suffering in Gaza, a sentiment perhaps foreign to Greenblatt or the editors of the Wall Street Journal. The students have seen Gazan universities, as well as Gazan hospitals, mosques, schools, cemeteries, bakeries, and farms, being destroyed by Israeli missiles and bombs. They've seen the mass amputation of children's limbs. And they, like previous generations of protesters against the Vietnam and Iraq wars, refuse to be silent while others suffer. This moral revulsion at complicity in atrocities is one of the most admirable qualities that young people possess. But what they're asking is for us to look at Gaza, not at them. U.S. media has something of an obsession with campus politics, especially in the Ivy League, and so we must be careful not to discuss the protests at the expense of discussing the violence that the protests arise in response to.
Israel's war in Gaza has been one of the deadliest and most destructive in modern times.
The Gaza City neighborhood, once known as El Rimel, the Sands, reduced to ashes. Its residents retrieve what they can, which isn't much. I got married this year, says Yahya Lahwel. What did I do? What have we done? You destroyed an entire neighborhood.
And again, it's women and children who are the victims. Ismail was just 7 years old when the missile struck.
In Gaza, even the dead cannot escape the indignities of war. More than a dozen cemeteries like this one in Jabalia, desecrated by the Israeli military.
I was serving in a commanding unit of a battalion that was fighting in Gaza. It feels like a video game for the first couple of days, but there is a moment you realize it's a freaking actual house. Just got completely destroyed. And I don't know, but there probably were some people in there. Maybe they are terrorists, maybe they are not, or Hamas, whatever. But you don't know. You know, we are paying back. That's like the Israeli retaliation.
And was that because they were convinced that they were hitting Hamas fighters, you think, or it went beyond that?
A lot of them don't draw the line between what we call militants or terrorists and what we would call civilians.
The war on Gaza has now been going for half a year. In that time, Gaza has essentially ceased to function as a society. Its basic infrastructure has all been wiped out. Its medical services have collapsed. Its people are on the brink of famine. Well over 30,000 Palestinians have been killed, including many entire families, and many, many more injured and traumatized. The daily death rate is higher than any other 21st century conflict, and the damage is comparable to the destruction of Dresden during World War II. Just recently, Palestinians began unearthing mass graves around Gaza's Nasser hospital, which an Israeli politician struggled to explain when asked about.
At least 283 corpses found in a mass grave at Nasser hospital in Khan Yunis. The UN Human Rights Chief has said he is absolutely horrified. Who do you think those bodies are?
Probably terrorists, because the ratio of combatant to innocent that Israel has is unprecedented in modern warfare. We know we've killed about 15,000 terrorists. There was a terrible battle in those areas. So the chances are...
How do you think these people died?
In gun battles with Israel.
Why do you think some of the bodies were found with ties around their hands?
Well, because we probably arrested the terrorists.
And then killed them?
Well, I don't know if the terrorists fought back. I wasn't there. But all I can tell you is that this has been a very difficult urban warfare, that nobody on earth has experienced this type of warfare, where the terrorists are hiding in tunnels, where they're cowards because they won't face their enemy. They just leave innocent people up there whilst they hide in tunnels that are bigger than the London Underground.
Gaza's worsening dire food crisis has been well documented. Cindy McCain of the World Food Programme, who is certainly no apologist for Hamas, has put it bluntly.
Right now there's 1.1 million people who are starving to death. Famine is imminent. So it is imperative that we get as many trucks as possible, north especially, to be able to stave off this famine. And we've got to do it now. We can't wait. The waiting has got to be done. We've got to get this going. It's too desperate not to.
Starving children have been pouring into Gaza's hospitals, at least the ones that remain functioning after repeated Israeli attacks. First-person testimonies coming out of Gaza have been harrowing, with Palestinians describing the agony of trying to keep their children alive on animal feed, or facing impossibly high prices for basic staple foods. The Israeli defense minister early in the conflict promised that all restraints on violence would be removed, presumably including legal restraints. And we've seen the results. Universities, schools, and hospitals have come under attack. An astonishing 390 educational institutions have been attacked and destroyed. Amnesty International has investigated numerous cases of civilian deaths and shown there was no evidence of military targets in the area at the time of the attack. Haaretz quotes a former IDF officer observing that Israel is attacking, quote, innumerable targets without asking whether it's worth attacking them, unquote. The Biden administration knew as early as October, according to the Washington Post, that Israel was, quote, regularly bombing buildings without solid intelligence that they were legitimate military targets. Amnesty International found that Israel was not giving Palestinian civilians effective prior warnings, in some cases not warning civilians at all, and in other cases giving inadequate warnings. An investigation by Israeli magazine 972 showed cases in which whole families have been wiped out while sleeping in their beds, and showed that these were not mere tragic accidents. After October 7th, according to the magazine's investigation, the criteria around harming Palestinian civilians were significantly relaxed in a manner contrary to previous IDF protocols. Multiple Israeli intelligence sources confirmed to the magazine that civilian targets like high-rises and residential towers in the heart of cities, as well as banks and universities, were being hit on the theory that a deliberate attack on Palestinian society would exert, quote, civil pressure on Hamas. That comports with what the IDF's spokesman had said publicly early in the war, which is that the goal was that every being left in Gaza would understand the price of starting a war with the state of Israel. That's in addition to many more outright genocidal comments that have come from Israeli politicians at many different levels of government. There's no doubt that the stated goal of making sure Gazans understand the price has been achieved many times over, and some of the survivors may even envy the dead. The bombings have produced the biggest cohort of pediatric amputees in history, since half the Gazan population is under 18. These amputations are often conducted without anesthetics. In addition, Israeli soldiers have gleefully broadcast much of the destruction on social media, leaving no doubt that a lot of the chaos and misery comes from dehumanization and bloodlust and is not simply regrettable collateral damage.
This is a how-to video on how to blow up a mosque in Gaza. Filmed, edited, and posted on Instagram by an Israeli soldier. It's one of dozens reviewed by CNN. In video after video after video, soldiers document the destruction of Gaza and rejoice. They film detonations to use as wedding invitations.
As surgeon Yasser Khan, who worked in Gaza, told The Intercept, the damage inflicted by Israel goes beyond the killings, physical injuries, and lifelong trauma. The campaign is ending Gaza as a physical place, turning it into a long strip of rubble.
I know we talk about the death and the disease and all that, but we also need to more talk about is the death of their culture and their civilization. Every single playground, hangout place, cafe, restaurant, a 500-year-old ancient mosque, 500-year-old ancient church destroyed, right? Their schools destroyed, their stadiums, sports facilities destroyed, their hospitals destroyed, there's cinemas destroyed, museums destroyed, archives where they kept their archives, erased, destroyed, burnt. Their homes, 80% of homes are all gone now.
The United States bears a great deal of blame for the situation, being Israel's leading supplier of arms and doing its best to shield Israel from accountability at the United Nations and in the International Court of Justice, where Israel currently faces prosecution for genocide. Just recently, the United States vetoed a UN resolution that would have joined most of the world in recognizing Palestinian statehood, undercutting the Biden administration's claim that it believes in a two-state settlement to the Israel-Palestine conflict. The Biden administration has, since October 7th, essentially said one thing and done another, voicing rhetorical concern for the rights of civilians while giving Israel endless, no-strings-attached weapons aid. The young people in the Gaza solidarity encampments aren't fooled by the crocodile tears of the Democratic administration. The unimaginable suffering of the people of Gaza, then, is the central fact explaining the rise of these protests. Demonstrators, such as this father in Los Angeles, have described how their values have influenced their decision to come out in solidarity with Palestinians.
Yeah, I'm here with Lázaro Abuelo. You are a father of a student at USC who's here. Tell me why you're on campus. You also said you're a Los Angeles resident.
I am here to support my daughter. She's studying here, and they're protesting against the genocide. And that's why I am against the genocide. My family is against the genocide. We think that no kid deserves to be killed.
Well, why did you come down to campus?
Yeah, because my daughter started organizing too. Says, hey, we have to support Palestine. And that's why I am here. Not only to support Palestine, we want the genocide to stop. But the students are so brave. Look at them. They don't want to leave the campus.
Does that concern you, though, as a father, that your daughter is somewhere?
Even though it concern me, but my daughter did the right decision. If she rather to be arrested fighting for Palestine, I will be the happiest daddy. I will be the happiest daddy if she's doing the right thing. And I imagine being a father in Palestine to see my kid be assassinated by Israel. That's not good. We are humanity. This is not a matter of religion, political, no. We are humans. We cannot support any genocide.
Colombia's protests in particular arose after the university's president, Minouche Shafik, testified to Congress. Students were outraged that instead of giving a robust defense of the right of free speech and peaceful protest, Shafik appeared to accept the characterizations made by Republicans, suggesting that those students who used the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" could be disciplined, and promising investigations of the university's professors.
He is still chair on the website, so has he been terminated as chair? Congressman, I want to confirm the facts before getting back to you.
I know you confirmed that he was under investigation.
Yes, I can confirm that.
Did you confirm he was still the chair?
I need to confirm that with you.
Well, let me ask you this. Will you make a commitment to remove him as chair?
I think that would be, I would, yes.
Shafiq attracted further outrage after calling the New York Police Department to arrest over 100 students who were staging a sit-in. The school suspended many students before their arrests, including Ilhan Omar's daughter, Isra Hirsi, meaning they were charged as trespassers on the university campus and lost access to university housing. This outraged many Columbia University faculty who have been demonstrating in solidarity with the arrested students and who have condemned the university's president. At other schools now, including Yale, the University of Texas, Emerson College, and NYU, students have also faced mass arrests. The University of Southern California canceled a commencement address by its valedictorian because she had made pro-Palestinian statements. Vanderbilt University has expelled students who participated in a protest after the school stopped an initiative to bar school funds from going to businesses that support Israel. 18 Pomona College students were arrested after protesting the removal of a pro-Palestinian artwork on campus. At Emory University, police used rubber bullets, tear gas, and tasers to break up protests, and even ended up arresting the chair of the philosophy department.
I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do for you right now?
Can you call the philosophy department office and tell them I've been arrested?
Philosophy department?
Yes. Call the philosophy department office.
I will. What's your...
I'm chair of the philosophy department.
I got you.
The Georgia lieutenant governor responded to Emory's arrests by explaining that, quote, "We will not allow pro-terrorist radicals and liberal anarchists to invade Georgia's campuses. These criminals have only one goal, disruption. These criminals will be punished." Presumably those criminals now include the faculty themselves, at least any of them who dare to demonstrate on campus for Palestine. Importantly, these kinds of authoritarian measures don't just harm the particular people they target. They also intimidate everyone else who may have been thinking of expressing an opinion. They're also part of a long history of attempts to punish pro-Palestinian speech and to crack down illegally on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that began long before October 7th. The use of force has been justified in part because the protests have been characterized by many as anti-Semitic, with some suggesting that they threaten the safety of Jewish students on campus. Benjamin Netanyahu even compared the demonstrators to Nazis, a statement that ultimately has the effect of minimizing the horrors of what happened in Hitler's Germany.
What's happening in America's college campuses is horrific. Anti-Semitic mobs have taken over leading universities. They call for the annihilation of Israel. They attack Jewish students. They attack Jewish faculty. This is reminiscent of what happened in German universities in the 1930s.
House Speaker Mike Johnson similarly characterized the protests as anti-Semitic.
The cherished traditions of this university are being overtaken right now by radical and extreme ideologies. They place a target on the backs of Jewish students in the United States and here on this campus. A growing number of students have chanted in support of terrorists. They have chased down Jewish students. They have mocked them and reviled them. They have shouted racial epithets. They have screamed at those who bear the Star of David.
Joe Biden also appeared to endorse this characterization. In fact, while there have been occasional instances of bigotry or violence, often by marginal outsiders unaffiliated with the actual universities, many Jewish students are among the leading activists taking part in the protests. At the Columbia demonstrations, Jewish students even hosted a special Passover Seder, which they said was to, quote, ensure unity in the struggle for Palestinian liberation across all faiths, and especially among those in the Jewish tradition that push back against the notions that Judaism is Zionism and that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism.
If our gathering does not motivate us to do everything in our power to end the genocidal violence Israel is unleashing upon Gaza, we will not have fulfilled the requirements of the Passover Seder.
They encouraged remembrance of Moses, who told Pharaoh, "Let my people go," urging today's pharaohs to let all of our people go, quote, especially the indigenous Palestinians who are resisting their occupation and ethnic cleansing. As John Ben Menachem, a Jewish Columbia student, wrote in an important essay for Zeteo, the presentation of protests as anti-Semitic and a threat to Jewish students completely mischaracterizes the situation. He writes, quote, "Here's what you're not being told. The most pressing threats to our safety as Jewish students do not come from tents on campus. Instead, they come from the Columbia administration inviting police onto campus, from certain faculty members, and from third-party organizations that dox undergraduates. Frankly, I regret the fact that writing to confirm the safety of Jewish Ivy League students feels justified in the first place. I have not seen many pundits hand-wringing over the safety of my Palestinian colleagues, mourning the deaths of family members, or the destruction of Gaza's cherished universities. I'm wary of a hysterical campus discourse gleefully amplified by many of the same charlatans who have turned DEI into a slur that draws attention away from the ongoing slaughter in the Gaza Strip and settler violence in the occupied West Bank. We should be focusing on the material reality of war, the munitions our government is sending to Israel, which kill Palestinians by the thousands, and the Americans participating in the violence." Unquote. Columbia professor Susan Bernofsky was similarly forceful in rebutting the accusation that protests are anti-Semitic.
I do not feel that this project is anti-Semitic in any way. I do feel that the students are highly critical of Israeli politics, and I do not believe that that is inherently anti-Semitic at all. And I do not feel threatened as a Jewish faculty member in any way by what's happening here on this campus, except by the arrest of many of our students.
As with the Black Lives Matter protests, Occupy protests, and others, those who have experienced the demonstrations up close can testify just how much they differ from the characterizations heard in the media. In fact, the protest encampments are spaces of warmth and community, where people come together in solidarity to try to stop a horrific injustice. I spoke with Dr. Stephen Thrasher, who had recently visited the Columbia encampment, and he told me what he saw there.
It's really beautiful to see the way that they were experimenting with creating a different kind of society. It's a dynamic I've seen in different kinds of protests I've covered over the years, Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter protests, where people are responding to something really horrific by trying to create the conditions of a different kind of society and distributing food, entertaining, educating one another. As a print journalist myself, or a person with a history of print journalism, it was very touching and funny to see the Columbia Daily Spectator get passed out, and almost like in a movie, people racing to read it and sitting down to read it once they got it. The same thing with the New York War Crimes, a parody of the New York Times, and the Independent were being passed out. And then there was this teach-in with Norm Finkelstein, which was everything that right-wing provocateurs say that they want, in some ways in a dialogue. There was also a really touching speech by a nurse who just returned from Gaza, bringing greetings from the people of Gaza and sharing some of the horrors he'd seen. And then it ended with a woman, I believe in her 70s, who had been arrested in the same spot in 1968, and wishing the students well. And it was really beautiful to see during the Muslim prayers, the Muslim students, while they were praying, other students surrounded them so they could have some privacy. And then there was also a Shabbat happening with Jewish students. I was there on Friday, so it was at sundown. I think it was and it was really touching to see them working together to think differently and really create a critical pedagogy, a political dialectic about the situations they were facing, and a real creativity to try to force the university to divest, but also to apply the things they're learning in class to a mini society they were making. I found it very beautiful and not threatening at all.
The killing of hundreds of academics, scholars, journalists, poets, essayists. This is what Palestinians call scholasticide, the killing of the infrastructure and the means of education. Meanwhile, in this city, the universities call the NYPD and barricade themselves against the grave threat posed by their own students, asking them, students embodying the spirit of the Seder, asking the most basic question, asking questions like, how can you claim to believe in anything at all, least of all us, while you enable, invest in, and collaborate with this genocide? Ain't gonna let racism turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let racism turn me around. Gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, marching up to freedom land. I ain't gonna let no APAC turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no APAC turn me around. I'm gonna keep on.
The test of whether a country is free is what happens to unpopular opinions, those that challenge existing authority. In Vladimir Putin's Russia, after the war against Ukraine began, we saw clips of heroic Russian dissidents being forcibly dispersed and dragged away by police for protesting the war. If controversial, despised opinions are punished, a society is not free. It's only pretending to be free. Issues like Israel-Palestine pose important tests to the country's values. Do we mean those values? Or are they fake? Do we allow freedom of speech only for speech that those in power like? Do we call the cops to drag people away for making a noise and standing on the wrong patch of ground? Are those conservatives who have spent years making campus-free speech one of their pet issues actually serious about campus-free speech? Or do they suddenly forget about it and start talking about radicals and terrorists and the need to restore order the moment the speech in question is pro-Palestine? Do we deal with those faculty we disagree with by publicly debating their ideas? Or do we get our member of Congress to pressure the university's president to remove those faculty from their job? If this is a free country, the answers to these questions are obvious.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War in mass marches, rallies, and demonstrations. Central Park is the starting point for the parade to the UN building. The estimated 125,000 Manhattan marchers include students, housewives, beatnik poets, doctors, businessmen, teachers, priests, and nuns. Makeup and costumes were bizarre.
To conclude, let's revisit a different era of campus protest, one with important lessons for our own time. In the 1960s, the U.S. was brutally decimating the population of Vietnam, waging a destructive war to defend a corrupt client state. As veteran William Earhart told this program, after he saw firsthand what was happening in Vietnam, it became impossible to ever see his country in the same way again.
I knew what I was doing was wrong. We were not helping the Vietnamese. We were not winning anything. This was crazy. What you're looking at is the destruction of everything you've ever believed about the world you live in and the country you live in and the person you are. All of it destroyed. I have never felt comfortable in the country of my birth since 1968. You know, all the stuff that we were told was all mythology. It had nothing to do with who and what this country really is.
In response to that unjust war, Americans took to the streets. In doing so, they risked not only their careers, but sometimes their lives, as in the case of the 4 students murdered at Kent State University in 1970. But as leading activist Jerry Rubin explained at the time, the anti-war movement felt that the United States was engaged in murder, and it was impossible to justify not dissenting against that crime.
I think the peace movement should have the anger of a Vietnamese woman whose child was burned by napalm, dropped by American planes, way up there in the sky. That's the anger the peace movement should reflect. The peace movement's got to go into the streets, and it's got to use the tactic of disruption, because the American people are drunk with apathy, because they don't care. Our country is now in the situation that Germany was in the 40s. We're committing mass murder.
Martin Luther King, similarly, was told that he should stick to civil rights activism and the particular problems affecting Black Americans. But in a famous speech, he explained why it was morally necessary for him to publicly campaign against the Vietnam War and the violence done by his country abroad, as well as that done at home.
And I say that those who are seeking to make it appear that anyone who opposes the war in Vietnam is a fool or a traitor or an enemy of our soldiers is a person who has taken a stand against the best in our tradition. Many persons have questioned me about the wisdom of my path. Why are you speaking about the war, Dr. King? Why are you joining the voices of dissent? Peace and civil rights don't mix, they say. And so this morning I speak to you on this issue because I am determined to take the gospel seriously. There is at the outset a very obvious and almost facile connection between the war in Vietnam and the struggle I and others have been waging in America.
MIT professor Noam Chomsky, who scathingly criticized his fellow academics for their failure to take a stance against the war, said the facts of what the U.S. was doing made resistance morally obligatory.
I've come to the feeling myself that the most effective form of political action that is open to a responsible and concerned citizen at the moment is action that really involves direct resistance, refusal to take part in what I think are war crimes, and attempts to raise the domestic cost of American aggression overseas through non-participation, support for those who are refusing to take part, in particular draft resistance.
Similarly, Jane Fonda, who became one of the most prominent anti-war activists of the time, said she felt an obligation as an American to stop her country from pulverizing Vietnam.
The many, many people in America who are speaking out against the crimes that are being committed in our name by Nixon and by the Pentagon, the people who are struggling to reestablish in America the qualities that we started out with. It is these people who are the real patriots. I lived in France for 7 years, and it was Vietnam, and it was the war in Vietnam who forced me to ask myself certain questions about America. And I went back to the United States because I wanted to fight there in my country, because I care about my country.
Another commonality between the 60s and our own time is that protests then were also characterized as traitorous acts of sympathy with the enemy, which should not be granted basic free speech protections. Here's racist politician George Wallace giving a characterization of anti-war demonstrators that has a ring of familiarity today.
And those who speak and call for the victory of the communists in the name of academic freedom are giving morale support and are aiding and abetting the enemy in Hanoi, Peking, and Moscow. And if I were the president, the first thing I would do is have my attorney general drag some of these bearded professors making such speeches before a grand jury and indict them and send them off to the penitentiary for what they are, traitors, because they are traitors.
There's another echo of the 1960s in our moment today. In 1968, dissent over the war made Lyndon Johnson so unpopular that he was forced to step aside. The Democratic Convention in Chicago that year became infamous as police attacked and brutalized anti-war demonstrators. Ultimately, the Democrats lost the general election that year, in part because the party's leaders had tied themselves to an increasingly unpopular and horrifying war.
Last month, the President of the United States said nothing you young kids would do would have any effect on him. Well, I suggest to the President of the United States, if he want to know how much effect you youngsters can have on the President, he should make one long-distance phone call to the LBJ Ranch and ask that boy how much effect you can have.
This year, polls currently show Joe Biden and Donald Trump running about even. But Biden's decision to keep funding and arming Israel, even as the war disgusts young people, may be a critical political error. As young people see Gaza wiped out and an endless stream of videos of Palestinian suffering, they may find it hard to support a president who is enabling one of the most destructive wars of our time, and who has refused to take even basic steps, like cutting off weapons aid or endorsing Palestinian statehood at the United Nations. One thing we do know is that the only way policies will change is if there is public pressure, and that pressure comes from protest. The Vietnam protesters ultimately succeeded in ending US involvement in Vietnam, and for decades afterwards there was a lasting popular reluctance to support uses of US military force. Likewise, Iraq protesters did not stop the war from happening, but their opinion about the war ultimately became the consensus view. Politicians who had supported the war, like Jeb Bush, Joe Biden, and Hillary Clinton, were embarrassed by their record. Protesters often risk a great deal, and with little benefit to themselves, and they're usually vindicated by history. Until then, we need to listen to what they're asking, and we need to keep our eyes on Gaza. In a statement, Columbia University professor and Palestinian American Rashid Khalidi said that the administration's actions there were disgraceful and in violation of all established procedures and due process. He praised Columbia's robust tradition of protest as one of its proudest marks in history, pointing out that faced with an ongoing genocide, these protesters have stood their ground, acting as their consciences dictated. Khalidi says it's obscene for Columbia University administrators to limit students' public protests and to punish them, or curtail the faculty's academic freedom and freedom of speech, calling this an abandonment of the most basic principles that govern academic life. Let's close then with something Khalidi said back in 2022 on this program. He encouraged us to be clear-eyed about the reality of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and to understand that it's ultimately a liberation struggle by people who are occupied and being denied statehood, who are subjected to a brutal apartheid regime and denied their basic human rights. Every story about the conflict needs to be understood in this context.
This is not a war between two peoples on a basis of equality. This is not France and Germany. This is a war on Palestine. This is not just a war waged by the Zionist movement in Israel. It's a war waged by Britain, by the United States, by the Soviet Union, by Britain and France on the Palestinians. It's a national project with a link to the ancestral Jewish link to the land of Israel, but it is also a settler colonial project by its own description and by comparison with any other settler colonial project. You can compare it to Ireland and you see all the parallels, or Algeria or whatever. Finally, what the Palestinians are doing is not engaging in terrorism, they're engaging in resistance, whether one likes their means or doesn't like their means. And I think that each part of the title of the book, The 100 Years War on Palestine, History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, is a reference to one or another aspect of that challenge to the received version, the false received version of history.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.